friends, good morning. Welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. In case you're new here, my name's Jennifer. And as you can see, today we're out here in my garden and I want to talk to you guys all about tomatoes today. Now, I love tomatoes. Tomatoes are my favorite fruit to grow in the garden. I grow lots of tomatoes and I like to grow a big variety of tomatoes. I like to have lots of different colors and flavors and sizes and shapes and just everything about tomatoes. I love it. So I have a pretty small garden, and so to grow a lot of varieties, I have to allocate a pretty big percentage of my garden to tomatoes. So I always want to make sure that I am choosing the best tomatoes possible that are going to give me the best flavor, the most yield in a small space, and be the most disease resistant to give me a nice long production season of tomatoes. I do grow mostly heirlooms because I like the variety that they offer. I like the real intense, old-fashioned, really good tomato flavor that they offer, and there's just so many great varieties. Plus, I love to be able to save seeds. So for all of those reasons, for the most part, I grow heirloom tomatoes. I do have a couple hybrid varieties that I like to grow, but as I said, mostly heirlooms. So I'm just going to give you guys a quick rundown of some of the tomato varieties that I grew this year. Some of them are new to me. For some of them, this is my first year growing them. Some of them I've grown many times and grow every year. So I'm just going to let you know what I liked about each one, what I didn't like about each one, which ones I'm going to grow again, which ones I'm not, and which ones I'm still deciding about. So I've broken this down into two categories, cherry tomatoes and big slicer tomatoes. So let's start with the cherry tomatoes. So first of all, this is my all-time favorite cherry tomato. I've grown this one in my garden, I think every year since I first started gardening, and it will be in my garden every year as long as I garden. And that is the Sun Gold. Now, of course, I mentioned that I grow mostly heirlooms. Sun Gold is one of the exceptions. Sun Gold is a hybrid tomato, and I love everything about it. It's a beautiful golden orange color. It's just the right size for snacking or salads. It has the most amazing flavor. It's very sweet, but it's got a good balance of acidity to it too. So that is by far my favorite cherry tomato. It produces all season long. Being a hybrid, it has a little more disease resistance than a lot of your common heirlooms. So I just love the Sun Gold tomato. I will grow it every year. Now, like most cherry tomatoes, it is a little bit prone to cracking. Most of your tomatoes are going to be prone to cracking when you have uneven watering. Like, for example, if it hasn't rained for a while, you haven't watered for a while, and then you get all of a sudden a heavy rain, that big change in the amount of moisture that the tomato is receiving is going to cause it to crack. And Sun Gold, probably I would say it's about medium on that scale. I have some tomatoes that crack much more easily. Some tomatoes are a little more crack resistant. For the most part though, it's kind of a trade-off. To have a crack resistant tomato, you usually need a thicker skin, which makes it a little bit less appetizing. So I think Sun Gold has a really good balance. That one gets an A+ in my book. I will grow it every year. Now, kind of along the same lines of Sun Gold, this year I tried for the very first time the Sun Gold Select. Now that is an open pollinated variety of Sun Gold. I did mention that I am trying to get into more saving seeds from my tomatoes. I think that's a really good food security practice. Plus, by saving seeds for your tomatoes, you're going to be saving yourself money and you're going to be insulating yourself against potential seed shortages. Sometimes if there's a crop failure or a bad growing season, a certain variety of seed won't be in stock that year. By saving your own seeds, you're going to guarantee that you have the seeds that you want. So all of that aside, those are my reasons for trying the Sun Gold Select this year. This was my first year growing it. I was very happy with it. For the most part, it was pretty much identical to Sun Gold. The tomatoes are shaped a little bit differently. They're like slightly oblong as opposed to completely round like the Sun Gold. But that didn't really matter to me. The flavor was very similar, the yield, the disease resistance, all of the main characteristics were very similar. So I'm going to be growing that one in the future too. I am going to be saving seeds from it, just trying to get it more acclimated to my specific growing conditions. Now, I will say it's similar enough to the Sun Gold that I don't think you really need both unless you're planning on saving seeds from the Sun Gold Select. I'll probably continue to grow both just to do more side-by-side comparisons as the years go on and see how they do in different growing conditions together to see how similar they really are. But I think that for the most part, they're essentially interchangeable, and so I've been really happy with the Sun Gold Select. As I said, I'll grow it again and try to work on saving seeds from it. Now the next variety of cherry tomato, and this is one that I grow every year as well, is Matt's Wild Cherry. This is a really small red cherry tomato. It's really sweet, it's very delicious, it's got a really good flavor. It's got a lot of tomato flavor concentrated into a really small tomato. It's a great tomato for salads. Now it's a little bit smaller than most cherry tomatoes, so that could be a positive or a negative depending on your purposes for it. Now I mostly use my cherry tomatoes in salads, as I said, so the size doesn't really matter that much. I do also like to use my cherry tomatoes in my favorite easy summer lunch, which I did a video on. I'll link that below so you can check it out. It's very delicious and easy. Definitely recommend that. So any of the cherry tomatoes that I'm mentioning would be great for that. So Maxwell cherry does have a very thin skin, which makes it extra delicious. It does make it a little bit prone to cracking, however. And so if I have a lot of Maxwell cherry tomatoes and I know it's about to rain, I will go out and pick all the ones that are ripe and all of the ones that are almost ripe to prevent cracking. If you pick tomatoes that are almost ripe, they will finish ripening inside your house. So that one is an excellent one. That is my daughter's favorite cherry tomato, so I'll be growing that one every year as well. Now this year for the first time I tried the black opal cherry tomato. This one I believe is developed from black cherry, which is a classic cherry tomato. It's kind of a dark purplish brown color. We love black cherry, so we decided to try black opal too to kind of compare. Now it worked out well that I tried black opal because this year none of my black cherry plants survived. So the only small dark tomato we had was black opal. So I was glad to have it. That being said, I greatly prefer black cherry to black opal. Black opal produced a decent amount of tomatoes. They had decent flavor. It was a decent tomato. Definitely not bad, but black cherry I find produces more and has a better flavor. So in the future, I don't know that we'll necessarily grow black opal again. I think we're going to try to bring back black cherry and grow that one instead. But that being said, if you only have access to either black opal or black cherry, they're both good and both definitely worth growing for the sake of having a variety of flavors and a variety of colors in your cherry tomato harvest. Now, one other cherry tomato that I tried this year for the very first time was the black strawberry. Now this tomato is beautiful. I'm going to show you a picture of it here. This is typical of black tomatoes where the parts of the skin that are exposed to the sun develop this deep purple, almost black pigment, and it's stunning. This was a gorgeous tomato. The flavor was okay. It was not my favorite cherry tomato for flavor. I'm not sure if I'll grow it again or not. Now, if you have a lot of space, it is definitely worth allocating some of that space to the black strawberry just for its beauty alone. And it doesn't taste bad. It has a decent flavor. I don't think that the flavor was amazing and I wouldn't grow it for flavor alone. And so because I have a smaller garden, I'm not sure if I'll allocate space to that in the future. I'll probably give it one more year and we'll see how it does. I did save some seeds from it this year, so I have my own seed stock now. That's another open pollinated variety as well that you can save seeds from. So that's the end of my list for cherry tomatoes. Let's move into larger slicer tomatoes now. Now, before we really get started talking about the slicer tomatoes, I do want to say that this year has been a challenging growing year, especially for tomatoes. Here in Connecticut, we have had almost no rain this summer. Now you can see behind me, I'm sitting in my garden this morning and my garden is wet, and that is because we had rain yesterday, and that is so exciting. But for the most part, this summer has been one of the driest summers that I remember, and I have been watering my garden, but I haven't been as consistent about it as I probably should be. So I just want to give a disclaimer that the growing conditions this year probably did negatively affect my tomatoes. That being said, some of my tomatoes handled those conditions better than others, and so I'm sort of comparing these tomatoes to each other to see how they handled the different growing conditions. So, all disclaimers aside, let's get into my big slicer tomatoes. So the first slicer tomato that I grew this year, and spoiler alert, this is my all-time favorite slicer tomato. It's delicious and amazing, and I love it, and that is the Cherokee Purple. This tomato is beautiful. It's a lovely dark purple color. It's just got such a rich color, and kind of going along with that rich color, it has a really rich flavor too. I like tomatoes that have a lot of flavor. I don't like tomatoes that are watered down. I don't like tomatoes that are too sweet without a good amount of acidity balancing them out. And the Cherokee Purple has a great balance. So you know that it's beautiful. You know that the flavor is amazing. So let's talk about some other characteristics of the Cherokee Purple. Now, it yields fairly early for an heirloom. If you have some early varieties, especially some hybrids, they will probably yield before the Cherokee Purple. It's not usually my earliest tomato, but as far as big heirloom slicers, it's usually one of my earlier ones. it usually gives me a fairly good yield. I usually get quite a few tomatoes from a Cherokee Purple plant, which for an heirloom is a pretty good thing, because while heirlooms have by far the best flavor and the best variety, they don't always have the biggest yield compared to a lot of the modern hybrids. I find that Cherokee Purple does have a really good yield, reasonable earliness. As far as disease resistance, I mean, most heirlooms are going to be susceptible to disease. Cherokee Purple is as well, but I find it's not as susceptible as a lot of other varieties. It holds out, in most seasons, it holds out long enough for it to really be worth growing for me. So I am going to always grow that one every year. I love it. That one gets an A+ in my book too. So I definitely recommend that. The next variety I'm going to mention is the Abe Lincoln. Now this was the very first year that I ever grew Abe Lincoln. I'm gonna say it did not do well for me. Now going back to my disclaimer, this was not a great year for tomatoes in my garden. So probably, to be fair, I should give Abe Lincoln another shot, but it did not perform as well under these conditions as many of my other tomatoes did, including several other tomato varieties that were new to me, all outperformed the Abe Lincoln. I will say the Abe Lincoln in my garden, you know, I can't even speak to the flavor because I did not, at this point, I didn't even harvest a single usable fruit. All of the fruits that I got had blossom end rot and were not really usable. Now, blossom end rot is a condition that your tomatoes will usually get when they are subjected to a lot of uneven watering. Basically, it's a calcium deficiency. But for the most part, it's not usually caused by a lack of calcium in your soil. It's usually caused by uneven watering, because when the plants are unevenly watered, they aren't able to consistently take up the calcium from the soil. Even if there is calcium in the soil, it's unusable to your plants. So that being said, this was an ideal year for tomatoes to develop blossom end rot, so I can't completely fault the Abe Lincoln for that. But as I mentioned before, I have so many other tomato varieties in my garden that did not suffer from blossom end rot the same way. And so I'm going to say that it's probably a little bit more prone to blossom end rot than a lot of my other varieties are. To be fair, I probably should give it another growing season, but I'm gonna have to decide if I want to do that or not, because when I have limited space, I want to make sure that I make the most use of that space possible. And a tomato that isn't really going to yield for me is not a good use of space. Again, it was a weird year, but Abe Lincoln, out of all the tomatoes that I grew, showed the most susceptibility to disease. It got blight earlier than most of my other tomato varieties, and the plants don't really seem all that healthy. So, I don't know. I may give it one more try because I have heard amazing things about it. I think a lot of this depends on your area. Now, I have heard so many people love the Abe Lincoln tomato and say it's the most amazing tomato. Beautiful fruits, delicious fruits, and I'm sure in other parts of the country it really is amazing. I'm in Connecticut, I'm in southern New England, and for some reason here for me it just didn't do that well. So I may give it one more try. I'll let you know next year if I decide to give it another chance. So we're going to move on to the next variety, which is white Tomasil. This is the second year that I've grown white Tomasil. Last year I got the seeds as a free sample, a thank you seed pack from Baker Creek. And so I got the free seeds and I decided to try it. This tomato variety was not on my radar until I got those free seeds. So I tried it last year, and I've got to say I was pretty impressed with the yield. It produced a lot of tomatoes for me. I also like that it's a different color. Now, it's called white Tomasil. It's actually a very pale yellow. Depending on when you harvest it, it can be like a very pale yellow cream color, or it can start to get kind of a pinkish blush. It's definitely a pretty fruit, and it definitely adds a really nice variety to your tomato basket. I've been impressed with the number of fruits that it produces. That is also one of my earlier heirloom varieties, and I just like that it's an unusual color. It has a decent flavor. It's not my favorite flavor, but it's good enough that I'm going to grow it for the sake of the variety and the sake of the production. It seemed to have average disease resistance in my garden. In my garden, tomatoes always get blight by the end of the year. I kind of have given up trying to prevent it completely, and what I try to do is just hold it off as long as possible so that I'm able to get a yield before the blight really sets in. So I will say white Tomasil performed about the same as most tomatoes in my garden when it came to blight. I will be growing that one again. I probably won't grow a large number of plants of it just because there are others that I prefer the flavor of, but I will probably grow one plant in my garden each year. So we're going to move on to the next tomato variety, and this was my very first year growing this tomato. This was the climbing triple crop. I've got to say I was very impressed with this tomato this year. These tomatoes were big, they were delicious, they were meaty. I loved them. The plants produced really well. They weren't the earliest tomatoes. I had several other tomato varieties that produced quite a bit earlier than the climbing triple crop. Because of the flavor and the size and the production, I will definitely be growing this one every year. I'm actually considering increasing the number of climbing triple crops that I'm growing and making this one of my primary red tomato sources. Now this one is an heirloom, but I believe it was an heirloom that was originally bred for production before all these modern hybrids became so popular. And you can really tell. So it's got the production, maybe not quite the level of production that a lot of the modern hybrids do, but it is a production variety and it still has that delicious heirloom flavor. I definitely recommend that one, and I will be adding that one to my must grow list in the future. So the next tomato variety that I'm going to mention, this was a new one for me this year. This one was the Black Beauty. Now this one definitely gets really good marks for beauty. It's a really interesting tomato. It's a deep red tomato inside, but the outside, similar to the black strawberry that we talked about before, wherever it's exposed to the sunshine, it gets that really deep purple, almost black pigment on the skin. Incidentally, that pigment is an antioxidant. It's actually the same antioxidant that you find in blueberries, anthocyanins, and it is very good for you. So eating the skin of the Black Beauty tomato is a great thing to do for your health. Now, those pigments they are destroyed by heat, and so cooking this tomato will destroy those health benefits, but if you eat it raw, then you're getting lots of extra health benefits from that pigment. Now I will say I liked the Black Beauty. It's one that I think I'm going to have to grow another year to really decide if it's going to be part of my must grow list or not. It had decent production, decent flavor, average disease resistance, so I'm really going to have to give it another try, but I liked it. I wouldn't say it didn't wow me the way the climbing triple crop did, but I think it's a decent tomato and definitely worth another shot, so I will be growing that one again next year. Now another tomato, and this was again one that I tried for the first time this year, and this was, if you've been following me all season, you've heard me struggle to pronounce this tomato time and time again. So we're going to say Dr. Weish's, Dr. Witchy's, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but either way, it's a beautiful big orange tomato. This is an heirloom tomato that I have heard rave reviews about, and so I had to try it for myself this year for the first time. So I grew it and I liked it. I will be growing this one again. I will say the production was not as high as some of my other varieties, but the flavor was delicious. It had about the same disease resistance as most of my other varieties. And it's a beautiful orange color. So I added a really nice variety to my tomato harvest. So I'll be growing that one again. I probably will not grow a lot of plants of it just because I have others that produce better. But for the flavor and the variety, I definitely think that one is worth growing again. So another tomato variety that was new to me this year was the Horizon tomato. This was a tomato I had never actually even heard of, but I got the seeds as a free sample with one of my seed orders, so I decided to give it a try. Now I will say I like this tomato. This is a pretty small slicer tomato, so it definitely doesn't have the size of some of those big heirlooms. But if you're looking for some variety in sizes, this was a good tomato. It had nice uniform fruits. They were pretty much perfectly round. They're kind of a dark pink color. They're really pretty. They had a really good flavor. They were pretty blemish free, so I liked that. The plant produced a lot of them. For the most part, I prefer larger tomatoes, and so I won't grow a lot of this one, but I will definitely always grow some of it just because I was impressed with the production, I was impressed with the earliness, I was impressed with the flavor. It was pretty good. Plus, it's always nice to have a few fruits that are blemish free, just the entire fruit is usable. As much as I love heirlooms, there are usually some spots that you kind of have to cut around. So it's nice to have one that you don't really have to do that with. And that one I believe is an heirloom. I know it's at least open pollinated. So that's a new variety to me. I recommend that one and I will grow that one again. So the next tomato I'm going to mention is the Castelluto Genovese tomato. This was my second year growing this tomato. And it's a very pretty tomato. It's a nice dark red, very fluted tomato. It's really pretty and it's really unusual looking. So I really like the look of it. I really like the flavor. It's got good flavor, especially when you slice into it. Those little slices almost look like a flower. They're really pretty and they are delicious. The plant also produced quite a few tomatoes. Now this is one that I'm glad I gave a second chance to. Last year I grew it in my garden and it was more prone to blossom end rot than some of my other tomatoes. I did get a fair amount of usable fruits, but I also did lose some to blossom end rot. This year it actually performed much better, which is interesting because last year we got a lot of rain and this year we did not get very much at all. So it's just interesting how different tomatoes thrive in different conditions. Either way, this is a good tomato. The one negative thing that I will say about it is that it is kind of prone to fasciated blossoms, which will kind of lead to those fused tomatoes that have a lot of kind of unusable spots that you really have to cut out. That is probably the one negative thing about this tomato, is it's also a fairly short tomato. It's kind of wide and disc shaped. And so because of that, you don't really get a lot of usable slices out of each tomato. So while the slices are beautiful, sometimes this tomato works better with something that you kind of have to chop up. I've also roasted it and made it into tomato soup. It's delicious that way too. So I will grow this tomato. It's not my favorite, but it has enough good qualities that I will continue to grow it again. So those are all the tomatoes that I can really give you a full review on right now. You can see behind me, I have some tomatoes planted for fall. These tomatoes have not yielded yet because I didn't get them in the ground until July. You can see they're just, I don't know if you can see that there. You can see they're just starting to set their first fruits. And so I'm hoping to get some tomatoes off of these plants before the first frost. So these are the Martino's Roma variety. I will give an update on these tomatoes later on in the fall. I will say so far, they've been disease resistant. So far, they look extremely healthy. They have lots of blooms, so I anticipate a really big yield. I can't give a full review on that yet because I have not harvested them yet, but I will keep you updated on that. So those are my 2022 tomato varieties. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts on each of those varieties. I hope this is going to help you decide what kind of tomatoes you'd like to grow next year. And please leave a comment below. If you have a favorite tomato variety that I did not mention, something that you recommend that I try, or that you just has been a go-to great tomato, leave a comment below and let me know, because I'm always open to trying new tomato varieties. And if you've tried any of these varieties that I've mentioned, let me know how they did for you, especially if you've tried ones that I mentioned maybe didn't do as well for me, like the Abe Lincoln. If that one has done well for you, let me know, and let me know what part of the country you're in, because as I said, different growing conditions can really make a difference as to which tomato varieties are going to work best for you. I'm just sharing the ones that work best for me this year, and I hope this is helpful to you. And remember to stay tuned so that I can give you my review this fall of the Martino's Roma tomato. I'm hoping to use a lot of these for preserving this fall. So that's kind of an experiment too, growing tomatoes for fall. So we'll see how that goes. And so I hope that this helps you with planning your 2023 tomato season, even though the 2022 season isn't really even over yet. But I'm always kind of thinking ahead and evaluating as I go to help me be prepared for next year. All right, so I hope you guys are having a great day. I hope you had an amazing tomato harvest this year, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye. See you next time.